the Crew 4 mission. To the left of John Shoffner's head, you can see the mission patch for that Crew 4 mission. And we're getting another view of one of the other crew members inside Freedom, that is Rayyanah Barnawi. This is also her first space flight. And as you can see, the crew is stepping through and reviewing procedures on the tablet that they have on their leg.
And SpaceX, Dragon, we're at step 10 now, ready for Dragon cabin configuration for departure complete.
Copy, Dragon 2.10. At this time, you are go for 2.103, all of Section 3 for LIO install, IMV duct teardown, and hatch closure. We're going to have you unseal and reinstall LIO cartridge 1 in the active cartridge slot. How copy?
Yeah, we copy step 3, all of step 3.
And Dragon, want to make sure you copied LIO cartridge 1.
Thank you. LIO cartridge 1. Right.
Okay, Dragon, and one more set of instructions. When you're complete with Section 3, pick up in the hatch closed event detail and complete suit donning.
Copy. Hatch closed, event details, and suit donning.
You got it, Peggy. Thanks.
And you just heard Peggy Whitson talking with the SpaceX mission director about some of the procedures, including LIO canisters. That's lithium hydroxide canisters, which are responsible for scrubbing carbon dioxide in the Dragon cabin throughout the transit from the International Space Station back to Earth. Again, for this undocking, the transit time is a little more than 12 hours, and we are targeting off the coast of Panama City for today's splashdown. Here in Mission Control Houston, we'll continue to track as Axiom works their way through these procedures. We'll cover live on air through hatch closure this morning, and then we'll take a brief break while leak checks occur, and then we'll be back on the air with both Axiom and SpaceX for undocking coverage.
And SpaceX Dragon on the big loop at 1316, LIO cartridge 1 was installed.
SpaceX copies LIO cartridge 1 installed at 1316. You are still go for IMV duct teardown and hatch closure.
And Dragon copies will continue. 3.5.
Hearing good callouts with the installation of that lithium hydroxide canister. Again, that scrubs carbon dioxide from the Dragon during the 12-hour transit. This is required because once the hatches are closed between Dragon and the International Space Station and the umbilicals disconnect and the Dragon vehicle undocks, Dragon Freedom will no longer be able to rely on the atmosphere from inside the International Space Station. So it will be up to the Dragon Freedom environmental control and life support systems for the journey home. And we are beginning to see the hatch close there in your screen. Ali, our Alqarni continuing to work on getting that hatch closed. As you can see here, he's not quite suited up in his launch and re-entry suit yet, but once that hatch is closed, he'll work on getting that spacesuit on. Once the hatches are closed, it takes about an hour for leak checks to occur. And a thumbs up from Ali.
SpaceX Dragon cabin configuration. SpaceX Dragon hatch is closed.
Copy, Dragon hatch closed. We've got a command here that will send imminently to transition the state machine, reference the hatch closed event detail, and I think you already know this, but continue suit donning.
Yeah, we'll continue suit donning.
And we just heard confirmation from the Axiom-2 commander, Peggy Whitson. The hatches are closed. The hatches between SpaceX Dragon Freedom and the International Space Station were closed at 8:20 a.m. Central Time this morning. Now, a sequence of events will occur in between our coverage, which we're going to wrap up here shortly.
Dragon Houston on the big loop for a comm check.
Have you loud and clear, Houston?
We have you loud and clear as well. We have configured RF communications and would like you to initiate comm checks with ISS and SpaceX at this time.
Copy. And station, Dragon, how do you read? Comm check.
Dragon Station, have you loud and clear.
Have you loud and clear too, Steve. And SpaceX Dragon, how do you read?
Dragon SpaceX, we've got you 5 by 5.
Great, we have you loud and clear as well.
So again, the hatch on the Crew Dragon Freedom was closed this morning at 8:20 a.m. Central Time. But there is one more hatch that needs to close, and that's on the International Space Station side. NASA astronaut Steve Bowen will be working to get that hatch closed. This is called the A-Pass hatch. He'll then make sure to take some photos of the hatch once it's closed to make sure there's no FOD or foreign object debris, to ensure that the hatch has an airtight seal before he continues to methodically step through the process to get the hatch closed and then work through the depressurization sequence. Once the two hatches are closed, it's going to create an area in between the two hatches, which we call the vestibule. Once that vestibule is immediately created, it will be at space station pressure, about 14 pounds per square inch, but we do need to get that vestibule down to 0.
IDA MOI photos are transferred on SSC 12.
Houston copies, SSC 12. Thank you.
So in order to get the vestibule down to vacuum, we will depressurize it. That process does take about an hour. We won't be on air monitoring that this morning, but we will come back on following depressurization ahead of undocking. Everything's still looking good this morning for an on-time undocking at 10:05 a.m. Central.
Houston Station, just a quick correction on the flashcard I used. It was seal number 1110.
We copy 1110.
And if you're just joining us this morning, you're getting a live view inside the SpaceX Crew Dragon Freedom, which has 4 private astronauts on board. The hatch to Crew Dragon Freedom is closed, and we are awaiting hatch closure on board the International Space Station ahead of undocking later this morning. Axiom 2 launched on Sunday, May 21st from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida and docked to the International Space Station the following day on May 22nd. During their 9 days in space, the crew has been working on over 20 different science experiments.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop for cabin temperature control.
Go ahead for cabin temperature.
Hey, Peggy, just some awareness. We commanded the hex bypass to allow crew control just now. It's on the maximum cooling setting, and a reminder that The temp control is allowed with 4.080 until pre-chill prior to deorbit.
Pressure control 4.080 until pre-chill for Dragon.
Good copy.
And you're looking at a view from inside the International Space Station as NASA astronaut Steve Bowen works through those procedures to get the hatch closed on the space station side. Once that is done, it will create that space we were talking about earlier, the vestibule, which will ultimately be depressurized before we can have our undocking later this morning at 10:05 a.m. Central. And as Bowen moves the camera slightly, you can see a good view of one of the spacesuits on board the International Space Station. That's the Exploration Mobility Unit, or EMU. We actually have a spacewalk coming up on June 9th with Steve Bowen and Woody Hoburg. They'll be working to install an upgraded IROSA, or International Space Station Rollout Solar Array, on the 1A power channel. And you just saw Woody Hoburg float by in the screen there as well. And you're also seeing a view of NASA astronaut Frank Rubio in the screen there. Frank Rubio is in the midst of a long-duration spaceflight, as are all the crew on board the International Space Station. However, when Rubio lands in September, he will have spent a total of 371 days in space, the longest cumulative time for any NASA astronaut. Crew on board is continuing to configure everything ahead of that hatch closure. That bag that you see Bowen zipping up now is what we call a cargo transfer bag. And this shot from inside Crew Dragon Freedom, again, the crew continuing to step through those procedures. The hatch is closed on Crew Dragon Freedom, but we are just waiting for the hatch to be closed on the International Space Station side. As you can see, the crew is suited up in their spacesuits. The launch and entry spacesuit, which is worn during all of the dynamic phases of the mission, including launch, docking, undocking, and re-entry and splashdown.
And SpaceX Dragon, all crew members are seated and good comm check.
Copy Dragon, 4 crew members suited, seated, and with good intercom checks. At this time, you are go for 4.011 suit leak check, all of Section 1, and we'll meet you in 2.2.
And we are starting in on 4.011 now.
And you do see the crew inside Freedom putting their visors down. This is going to be part of the procedures to step through those suit leak checks. This is a precautionary measure just to ensure everything is looking good on the spacesuits ahead of undocking. The spacesuits do provide an extra layer of protection during the dynamic phases of the mission. It'll be about a 12-hour transit from undocking to splashdown today. The crew will have the opportunity to remove those spacesuits and get a little bit more comfortable following undocking. And again, we are targeting splashdown off the coast of Florida near Panama City. Everything looking good for an on-time splashdown this morning at 10:05 a.m. Central. And another...
SpaceX Dragon, we are ready to pressurize. Set 2.2.
Copy Dragon, we're with you. You are go to initiate suit leak check.
Inward.
So just a quick recap of where we're at right now. Earlier this morning at 8:20 a.m. Central, the hatch to Crew Dragon Freedom was successfully closed. At this time, we're awaiting the closure of the hatch on board the International Space Station side, that APAS hatch. You see NASA astronaut Steve Bowen continuing to work through procedures ahead of that hatch closure. Following this, the vestibule will be depressurized. This process takes about an hour. And then, assuming all goes well, Crew Dragon Freedom will undock at 10:05 a.m. Central Time this morning. We're targeting a splashdown off the coast of Panama City, Florida this evening around 10:04 p.m. Central. As Steve Bowen continues to work through those procedures to get the APAS hatch closed, the International Space Station.
And SpaceX Dragon, it looks like we have 4 good suits.
Copy, Dragon. We see the same 4 good suits. Next up is vestibule depress. Stand by just a few minutes while ground teams confirm we are ready for that.
Copy, standing by for vestibule depress.
And hearing from Axiom-2 Commander Peggy Whitson that 4 good suit leak checks occurred inside the Crew Dragon Freedom. Again, Steve Bowen is continuing to step through those procedures to get the APAS hatch closed. The International Space Station is currently flying 270 statute miles over the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of New Zealand. And continuing to get a view inside Crew Dragon Freedom, you're looking at the Commander Peggy Whitson in the middle of your screen, and to her right is the pilot John Shoffner. Also on board are Ali Alqarni and Rayyanah Barnawi, both of whom are representing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And getting a slightly different shot from inside Crew Dragon, this one of Rayyanah Barnawi on your left and pilot John Shoffner to her left. And we are continuing to await the go for the APAS hatch closure. We are in a brief expected handover between satellites, but will regain video and communications with the International Space Station here shortly. Once NASA astronaut Steve Bowen has the go to close the hatch, that APAS hatch, he'll step through the procedures to get that completed. Following the closure of the hatch, he'll work to take some photographs of the hatch to ensure that there's no FOD or foreign object debris. And once this is complete, he'll have the go to begin the depressurization process. Again, that process takes about an hour, and it brings that space between the Crew Dragon, Freedom, and the International Space Station hatches, that space that is created called the vestibule, down to vacuum. This is required before the Crew Dragon undocks from the International Space Station. Still targeting an on-time undocking this morning at 10:05 a.m. Central. And you're getting a view of the International Space Station Flight Control Room here in Houston, Texas. The team's here.
Dragon, SpaceX, ComCheck on Dragon to ground.
It's Dragon to ground.
Hey John, had you 5x5, just checking that we had this one working before we undock. Still working on closing the APAS hatch, but we'll get back to you on the big loop here shortly for vestibule depress.
Copies will be right here.
And that was the voice of pilot John Shoffner speaking to the ground. Just a quick update that they are still working to get that APAS hatch closed on the International Space Station side. And following that, they'll step through the procedures for that vestibule depressurization. And as we look ahead to undocking at 10:05 a.m. Central, this will actually be a 5-minute sequence once the command is initiated. Once that command is set, it begins the retraction of umbilicals that have been providing power and communications data in between the Crew Dragon Freedom and the International Space Station. Right now, the Dragon is being held to the International Space Station by a hard mate of 12 hooks. Those will be released 6 at a time to release any stiction. What they'll do is have a couple of undocking burns. These are very short pulses to actually physically separate the Dragon from the International Space Station. Physical separation again scheduled for 10:05 a.m. Central Time this morning. Continuing to get a view inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room. The team here is working with both Axiom and SpaceX to oversee the operations that we're covering right now. Following exit of the approach ellipsoid, those integrated operations will discontinue, and it will really be up to SpaceX and Axiom to get Crew Dragon Freedom home from there. And you are seeing some flash there as NASA astronaut Steve Bowen gathers some imagery of the hatch. Again, he's checking to ensure that there's no FOD or foreign object debris that could pose a problem prior to undocking. And we are getting a view back inside the Crew Dragon Freedom. You see Rayyanah Barnawi there, as well as the pilot John Shoffner. Onboard Space Station NASA astronaut Steve Bowen is continuing to step through those procedures to get the hatch closed, the APAS hatch rather, closed here shortly. Once he does that, that will wrap up our coverage, our solo mission coverage here in Mission Control Houston, but we'll be back on the air to cover undocking as well as to cover undocking with SpaceX and Axiom.
Station Houston on the big loop. This is for Steve. You are go at 5.3 to close the APAS hatch when you get there.
And Houston Station just completed the hatch seal inspection, and I am going to close the APAS hatch.
We copy.
And hearing that Steve Bowen has inspected the hatch closure and has the go from the ground to go ahead and close up that APAS hatch. Once those hatches are closed between both Freedom, which already is closed, and the APAS hatch will create that vestibule. Currently, it's at the same pressure of the International Space Station, just above 14 pounds per square inch, but we do need to get it all the way down to vacuum. This depressurization is a very methodical process which takes about an hour. Here in Mission Control Houston, we'll continue to monitor that while we're off air. And you do see that APAS hatch is now closed. We are still on track for an on-time undocking today at 10:05 a.m. Central this morning. So with both the Crew Dragon Freedom hatch closed and the APAS hatch, that will do it for us for now here in Mission Control Houston, but we'll be back on the air joined by SpaceX and Axiom for undocking coverage at 9:45 a.m. Central, so stay tuned for our coverage of that. We'll be covering the operations as the undocking occurs, and Axiom 2 heads back home after a 9-day mission in space. So until then, thank you for joining us for hatch closure coverage, and we'll see you soon for undocking coverage. This is Mission Control Houston.